hear from our own Department of Legislative Services to present their thoughts on FY21. As many of you know who've been following this, on July 1st, the Board of Public Works took action on a number of cuts to the budget to help us end the year balanced and begin FY21 in a method in which we hope we will not have to do any major or severe cuts through the fall. And then the governor is going to be introducing the budget for next year, and together the governor, the administration, and the legislature will set budget priorities for that year. This is an unusual time, and the closure, as we needed to do, of our state and businesses and have taken a toll on our revenues. We will know better what that toll is after July 15th, when the end of the fiscal year comes and we can do an assessment of the revenues. So we are kind of, as I say, and I said in the press last week, we're in the middle of a card game and there's several other cards to be played before we see the full picture. But certainly this committee and the Budget and Tax Committee on the Senate side, our fiscal leadership in the Maryland General Assembly will play a significant role in how and where cuts get taken and what services we feel we must maintain. I will say from the outset that House leadership, fiscal leadership feels very strongly about where we can and when we can protecting our state workers. It is those state workers that kept needed services going during this pandemic, which still continues. They kept kids learning in schools. They provided health care. They protected people in a public safety setting. So we must now, I think, always put our state workers first. Secondly, we do not want to see the public schools in particular, or any schools. Certainly we want to see learning take place in the state of Maryland. If there's one population that unanimously, like every one of them got affected by COVID-19, it's our school children and our teachers and our principals and our parents. So we want to protect education. We want to protect public health. We now know how important that is. And we want to, of course, protect public safety. So that's my kind of overview of how we'd like to see things moving forward. I want to now turn it over to David Romans, who is from the Department of Legislative Services. He's our policy analyst who will go through a slideshow and a discussion about the upcoming budget. David, good to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you. We're going to go through a couple of slides just to give you some context to where things stand in terms of revenue outlooks and some of the pressures on spending, and then kind of go through the administration's plan and kind of where it leaves us. So we can go to the next slide. All right, so this slide shows you ongoing general fund revenues going back to fiscal 15 through the estimates for fiscal 22. The blue dotted line is the BRE's more favorable of the two forecasts that produced in May. It's S2 scenario. The red is the less favorable S4 scenario. As you can see, in either case, not only are revenues missing the estimates for the original estimates for fiscal 21 and 22, but they're going to be lower than prior year revenues. Under the S2 scenario, we're going to be back to roughly fiscal 18 revenue levels. Under the bleaker S4 scenario, by fiscal 22, our revenues are back to around the fiscal 15 level. So we're definitely going to be operating with less cash under either scenario than we've had the last couple of years. It kind of illustrates how challenging this is going to be. We can go to the next slide. All right, so this shows you for our Temporary Cash Assistance Program, the number of recipients by month going back to July of 1999. And in January of this year, we had less than 40,000 people. We were pretty much at a low point in this 20-year period. As you can see, we've now more than doubled the caseload to DVM's estimate, or from information from Human Services, is about 83,000 people in June. That's more than at any point during the Great Recession, and more than any point going back to July of 1999. So we're basically at a 20-year high, and we'll see where the trajectory goes in the next couple of months, but it could go higher. So in addition to that revenue pressure, we're getting pretty extraordinary spending pressure in some of our entitlement programs. So that's sort of just a backdrop for kind of where the administration stood. We can go to the next slide. Along with the Board of Public Works actions, the administration sort of set forth a $1.45 billion set of actions that between VRFA and BPW and other things they can do would help improve our budget outlook. And this pie chart just shows you the components of that at a really high level. The blue is what the BPW actually approved, $395 million of reductions on July 1. The red is the BPW items that the governor initially proposed, but the board did not choose to vote on or chose to put off to a future date. The governor indicated it would probably be August when these items would come back, a little over 200 million more of cuts. There's about 119 million of future actions the administration believes it can do that may not require either BPW or legislative action. That would include things like employee furloughs or temporary salary reductions. And then the purple shows you roughly half of their actions would actually be items that would be before you in a Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act come the session. So let's go to the next slide. All right, so what this shows you is we look just at that 395 million of reductions that the BPW made. On the left-hand side, the bars represent the share of the fiscal 21 budget, general fund budget, that each of these components make up. So local aid, for example, is about 38% of general fund appropriations for fiscal 21. Entitlements, 21%. On the right-hand side, those bars are their share of the cuts. So what you can see is local aid was a very small share of the cuts that the Board of Public Works approved. Entitlements similarly took a smaller share of the cuts than they are of the total appropriation. The area that really saw significant cuts relative to their overall share of the budget was the public higher education institutions, which were reduced by over $130 million. Now, part of that is because incorporated into the higher education institution cut was any impact on employee compensation. Now, the schools will work that out individually. That it's up to them to negotiate with their unions, but essentially they've already seen their cut that relates to employee compensation taken, while it's been put off making any reductions related to other state employees. So that's part of why the higher ed looks so disproportionately large. As you'll see in a moment, when you look at the governor's whole plan, higher ed doesn't stand out as such a disproportionate share of the actions. Now let's go to the next slide. All right, this is the grisly detail of the 395 million of actions. I'll just go through the major ones, and I'm sure you're aware of most of these things. University System of Maryland and Morgan State combined for about 126 million in reductions. That's roughly 9% of their funding for fiscal 21, of their general fund funding. USM took a little bit larger share of their budget as a cut than Morgan did. Cade Community College funding formula, level funded, $36 million cut. They were supposed to go up a little more than 14% in fiscal 21. All right, the Medicaid hospital deficit assessment. So this is an interesting item. The board has cut general funds, assuming that the deficit assessment will be raised above where it is in current law. To actually get these savings, you're going to have to raise that assessment by 35 million come the session, or these savings will not materialize. And that would bring the deficit assessment up to about 330 million in fiscal 21. WMATA, you had appropriated 125 million of general funds in the dedicated purpose account to help fund WMATA. The governor's cutting 28 million here. His BRFA proposes to cut the other 97 million in general funds. It is not clear whether this is a true cut where WMATA will never see the money, or if MDOT will backfill some of the reductions. We did not get a clear answer on that. Juvenile services and public safety, there's assumed operating savings in both agencies totaling a little over $22 million. The Selinger Independent College formula gets level funded, saving 10.6 million. And cybersecurity enhancements for state government. The governor had put in 20 million in the budget for fiscal 21. This cuts that money in half. And those are really the large items. You can see there's a lot of detail on other smaller items down the list. I think we can go to the next slide. All right, so this looks similar to the chart you saw a couple of slides ago, except for the whole governor's plan, the whole 1.45 billion of actions that includes things he'll propose in the BRFA. And the left-hand side is the same as you saw before. It's the share of the appropriation that each of these components makes up. The right-hand side shows their share of the cuts. And you can see, as I mentioned before, that it's much more aligned. Local aid is 30% of the cuts, 37.5% of the general fund budget. So a little bit closer than they were in the earlier chart. Entitlements is still treated better than most areas, I think partly because you were seeing such growth in the caseloads and pressure in those areas. But most of the areas are fairly proportionate to their shares of the budget. Now let's go to next slide. All right, slide 7. This is the detail on the big items that the governor is proposing to do either in a BRFA or later this year through the BPW or on his own. The biggest single item is a to-be-determined cut to education aid of $200 million. That would have to happen during session. The governor cannot cut education aid without the General Assembly acting. Salary savings. So there's a couple of components to this. One is the governor is proposing not to fund the COLA for state employees that is effective January 1. That was supposed to be a 2% COLA. He's also taking back the merit increase and COLA for the law enforcement officers. It was supposed to be effective July 1. And as I understand it, they have actually negotiated that through collective bargaining. And then there are savings in here from either furloughs or a temporary salary reduction. The savings are equivalent to about 3% of salaries. It has not been determined or completely negotiated how these savings will be achieved. One thing to note is the law enforcement officers got themselves out of this part of the reduction as part of their collective bargaining. So they will not be furloughed or see a temporary salary reduction. Local government aid, there's another kind of plug here, 130 million reduction of unspecified local government aid. 100 million of savings in Medicaid from transferring surplus reinsurance dollars that are currently set aside for the individual health insurance market, the health exchanges program. They don't need that money in the next few years, so the money would be used to fund Medicaid instead. WMATA, this is the rest of the general fund appropriation for WMATA that I mentioned before. Another big item is $79 million for provider rate increases. This was for DDA and behavioral health and Medicaid community providers. They were supposed to get a 4% rate increase. The tricky part about this is right now they're saying this was something that would be before the legislature during session, but the savings reflect a full year of savings. So by the time you finish session, the year will be 3/4 over. So you'd be trying to get that 79 million of savings, which is a whole year's worth of savings, in 3 months out of the providers. So it puts the providers in a very difficult position if they're trying to hold back money, expecting that cut to come at, near the end of the fiscal year. For the most part, the governor is eliminating general fund pay-go. You can see some of the big programs being impacted there. There's no promise of backfilling that with bonds at the moment. Retirement reinvestment. So the state has been putting in an extra 75 million to shore up the funding status of the state retirement system. The governor's proposing to cut the 75 million extra from fiscal 21. We would still be putting in our actuarially required amount. This is the extra amount that he's cutting. Employee and retiree health insurance, 33 million is savings here, mainly from favorable trends in fiscal 20, as people didn't use healthcare in the spring as they were trying to avoid going to the doctor or to the hospital. And then there's a fund balance transfer for the state unemployment insurance fund. This is just related to state employees. We have a big surplus, so they're transferring $30 million to the general fund. And then maybe one other notable one to mention, $28 million eliminating the teachers supplemental grant program, which is a local aid program that a few counties benefit from. Back when you shifted some of the teachers' retirement costs to the counties, this program was created to help mitigate the impact on some of the more hard-hit counties, particularly large impact on Prince George's County, significant impact on Baltimore City as well as a few other counties. And then there's a plan to change overtime rules that would save about $20 million. Basically what they're doing is saying that if you take leave during the week, that those leave hours don't count toward earning overtime, so that you have to actually work 40 hours, not just have 40 hours of total time. So this will particularly affect the folks in the corrections system, workers there. And then there's some other smaller cuts, a couple of local aid cuts there, the disparity grant and the assessments and taxation department's costs being shifted to local governments. So those are sort of the big items. Again, these are not items that have been acted on yet. Most of these will be before you during the session, so you'll have a chance to opine on them. Let's look at the next slide. All right, there's a lot of numbers on this page, but we kind of want to show you the outlook going forward. So we show you 3 years, fiscal 20 through 22. This is for the S2 BRE revenue scenario. That's the more favorable one. And it also takes into account the DLS entitlement forecast that we updated in May to reflect expected increases in Medicaid and temporary cash assistance. And up near the top, we've accounted for the BPW actions on July 1st. So that leaves us, after the BPW actions, with about a $500 million hole in the fiscal year we're just finishing up, a $2 billion hole in fiscal 21, and a $3.4 billion hole in fiscal 22. One thing that will help us is there's federal money that will help offset some of the shortfall. The Coronavirus Relief Fund can be used to fund policing salaries and some public health salaries. It looks like we can probably generate about 100 million of savings in fiscal 20, 250 million in 21. Enhanced Medicaid match in fiscal 20 and 21. We're receiving, at least it looks like, through calendar year 2020. That gets us roughly 300 million in each fiscal year. So that really where we are is that remaining budget challenge bold line, a little over 100 million problem in fiscal 20, and then 1.5 billion in 21, 3.4 billion in 22. And I think the real focus here is when you combine 21 and 22, you have a combined gap of about $5 billion. That represents 12% of the planned spending over those 2 years. So then the question is, well, how do you deal with that gap? We've kind of got a menu of solutions there at the bottom. It starts with the administration options that they've laid out. In fiscal 20, they're expecting to have agencies revert some money that's unspent. They expect to do those additional BPW cuts I mentioned earlier, and then their BRFA actions. And both of those items will likely produce savings in fiscal 22 if they're continued. And then the other part of their plan is to use the rainy day fund to get us out of fiscal 20 and use the rainy day fund probably to get us out of fiscal 21. Probably need to use 400 or 500 million of the rainy day fund in fiscal 21. That would leave us with about 500 million in the rainy day fund in 22, which is not going to be enough to get it to balance the 22 budget. With their actions, we would still be short by a couple of $1 billion. There are a number of other resources and options to consider. The legislature could override the governor's veto of the tobacco tax. There's the hope that Congress will act and provide the state additional money just for context, I remind everybody that the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which was the big component of the CARES money that was supposed to help state and local governments, only gave the state and local governments combined in Maryland a little over $2 billion. So we have a $5 billion problem. If we get a similar chunk of money out of any future congressional action, we still have a very large hole to fill. Some other things that might help us, but probably in the $100, $200 million range, our bond premiums may come in strong again this July, and when we do a bond sale in the winter. And we'll see how our fiscal 20 revenues close out. As you know, the income tax filing deadline is coming up on the 15th. So we'll see by the end of July, we should have a pretty good idea whether we over-attained our fiscal 20 revenue estimate or not. And then there's always, of course, other options in terms of budget reductions and fund balance transfers that the General Assembly could do. So kind of big picture, that's sort of where we are and sort of the options going forward. Let's look at the next slide. So this is the super bleak scenario. This is the S4 revenue outlook. Everything else on the page is the same, but if you look at that remaining budget challenge there before the menu of solutions, here when you combine the 21 and 22 gaps, you're up to $6.8 billion. And that's a really staggering level for the state to deal with. So hopefully we end up closer to the S2 revenue scenario. Thus far, our revenues seem to be proceeding closer to the BRE S2 scenario, but it's very early and hard to know how that will change. Next slide. All right, there's two other challenges that really weren't incorporated into the forecast we looked at. One is the entitlement caseloads are growing even faster than we expected back in May when we did our forecast, probably adding about 40 million to the challenge in 21 and 22. The other kind of bigger problem is the Education Trust Fund, which comes from the casino revenues. So fiscal 20, we now know we closed 155 million short of the estimate. And in fiscal 21, the gap is expected to be anywhere from 176 to 279 million. Problem here is that the administration has not come up with a plan to backfill for the fiscal 20 revenue shortfall. And that's money that went out the door. The local school systems have received that money. So we're going to have to backfill that. And similarly, we probably need to backfill fiscal 21 unless we're going to make much deeper cuts to education aid. So that's a significant challenge that you should probably talk to the administration when they come up about what their plan to deal with it is. Next slide. I thought it was worth noting that there's a few things that have been done many times in the past that were not in the administration's plan. The first is transfer tax revenues have frequently been diverted from PAYGO to the general fund. And then in some years, we've backfilled with bonds to keep the activities like open space funded going forward. The administration has proposed no use of transfer tax revenues to help with the general fund budget problem. There's roughly 140 million there that could be used. And again, it could be backfilled with bonds if that's the choice. Local income tax reserve fund was a very popular piggy bank during the Great Recession. There's probably some money, not a lot, but 100 million or more there that could be used. That's more of a temporary solution, but it is some cash that's available. And then there's favorable trends in healthcare throughout the state because people didn't use healthcare. Yet it was noticeable the administration did not cut the managed care rates for Medicaid providers, although it's believed that they too are benefiting from those favorable trends. And there was certainly some room for cuts there. So 3 areas that have traditionally been reduced or had funds transferred from them we did not see in the administration plan. Next slide. I just wanted to do a little tangent here on the use of that federal coronavirus relief fund. The concern here is we got 2.3 billion. We gave $1 billion to the local governments. A lot of it we were required to give to the local governments. And the administration has not been very forthcoming on how they plan to spend the state's 1.3 billion. They need to do budget amendments. They have not submitted budget amendments. And the only information we really have on how they're planning to spend it is on the next slide, and it comes from press releases that the governor has put out. So you can see the billion that goes to local governments. I talked about earlier that looks like there's about 350 million that can be used for general fund relief. And then the rest of the page is basically items that the governor has announced by press release. But again, we have not seen budget amendments or much detail on how this money will be used. When you total it all up, there's about 450 million left unallocated. Presumably, most of this money needs to be used to fund some of the emergency contracts the state entered into to respond to the COVID-19 issues and other, extraordinary expenses we've incurred. But again, this is an area where we think it would be helpful if the administration was a little clearer on how they plan to use that 450 million and perhaps provide you a little more detail on the other programs. Next slide. All right, so in conclusion, I guess there's just a couple of points we want to leave you with. First off, it's a very dynamic time. I mean, everything is uncertain. We have these revenue estimates, but they're subject to any impact from a second wave. There's we don't know when the vaccine or effective treatments will become available and how that'll affect our revenue outlook. And we don't know whether Congress will act, and if so, if they do so in a magnitude that really helps the economy and helps the state budget outlook. As a reminder, the state forecast assumes that there's no second wave, no further shutdowns this fall. And it assumes a vaccine does not become available until next summer. So there's some good news and bad news in there, but that's sort of what everything is being built off of right now. Second point is just what I made earlier, that we're really looking under the favorable scenario at a $5 billion challenge over the next, really to be solved over the next 7-8 months as you go through the next session. That's a substantial portion of state spending. And I guess the final thought, as I mentioned before, is it seems very unlikely that the federal aid is going to be in the $5 billion magnitude. So I think that people need to recognize that there's going to need to be significant actions at the state level in terms of reductions and probably repurposing some funds in order to get us through fiscal 22, through 21 and 22. And may have to be even more ongoing because the revenue forecast for the future years is also rather negative at the moment. So I think it's got to, while we hope for some federal money, we need to be prepared to take actions at the state level. Happy to answer any questions, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, as always. And before we take questions, I just want to recognize that the Speaker of the House, Adrian Jones, has joined us. So welcome to the Appropriations Committee. Welcome back home, as we say to you when you come on our meetings. You're very welcome. Did you want to say anything, or you just want us to go on into questions?
We'll go right into the questions.
Okay, thank you, Madam Speaker. We'll take questions, and the way it's best for you to ask questions is to toggle down to participants and put your the little blue hand signal up saying that you have a question, and I'll just recognize you as I go down the line. And so the first question is for Delegate Corman.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, Madam Speaker. David, thanks as always for the presentation. Two, I think, relatively brief questions. One, I just noticed in the DLS options, you did not include overriding the governor's veto of the digital sales tax, not the advertising tax, but the sales tax. And I was wondering if that's because it's designated to the Blueprint Fund. Is that why that wasn't included?
Right, that's why we didn't include it. It certainly could help depending on how that Blueprint Fund gets used to deal with the challenge.
Right. And second question, if I may, Madam Chair.
Mm-hmm.
I just want a better understanding of the provision BPW is operating under here, which obviously they're going to have to operate under again. I think we all recognize the difficult reality we're in. It's 7-213 of the State Finance and Procurement article. So it says they can cut 25% of any appropriation, although it removes some things like the regular pension funding and K-12 education. How is an appropriation defined? Is that a line item of our budget? Is that an entire agency? What is it 25% of? And then the follow-up to that is it 25% every time they meet? Or is it a total of 25% of what we appropriated, until the next time we're, do a budget. And if you don't know the answer, I'm happy to follow up with you later.
Yeah, it's the appropriation. I mean, we have appropriations in the budget bill, and you can't cut more than an appropriation for that, whatever line item is in the budget bill. But often in the budget bill, a lot of things are rolled up into a single line item in the bill. So some things like WMATA, they were limited because that was its own sort of line item. So they could only cut 28 million or so through the board. Whereas other things, there's a lot of flexibility. In Medicaid, it's all chunked in like one big number. So there's a lot of flexibility to make cuts there. My recollection, but we can confirm this, is that it's generally seen as you can cut 25% from the original appropriation, but I can confirm that.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Delegate Proctor. Delegate Proctor?
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, David. I'd like to share a comment and then ask a question. First of all, my daughter-in-law, who's in a nursing home for 3 years, is currently in the hospital with COVID-19. I bring this up because she was identified almost a week ago with pneumonia. She had been tested, but there were no results. So I bring that up to say that the staffs, and this particular one that we can speak for, are not getting the test, and the tests, when done, are just taking as long as a week to get the results. And so we have someone now who was treated almost a week for pneumonia when in fact she had the virus. So when we talk about monies, I just wanted to put that out there. But I have a question about the percentage of the budget that is used for public safety. Do you have that, Dave, or is that something you could give me?
I don't have it off the top of my head, but we can certainly get you that percentage.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. Vice Chair Jackson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Got it right this time. Thank you, David, for your presentation. Two quick things. You talked about the local income tax as a possibility. Do you think that there may be a challenge from the locals regarding that? Is that dollars that are due to the locals, or is that dollars that have been available to us at the state level?
So the state collects the local income tax on local government's behalf, and there's a very large accounting reserve as we distribute the money at certain points in the year. That accounting reserve has something like $900 million in it. And our assessment is that we can continue to make all of the payments if we have to the locals to distribute the money to them and still take out at least $100 million from that account without impacting any local government revenues in any way. This was a strategy that was done multiple times during the Great Recession. I think often local governments see it as preferable to actually having their state aid cut. And like I say, it's largely an accounting issue as long as we don't take too much. Now, the downside of it is that it shows up on our state books that we haven't fully funded the accounting reserve. So it does get attention from groups like the rating agencies and so forth. So there is a little bit of a downside, but as a short-term solution, it does provide some cash without any real pain for anybody.
Yeah, these are unprecedented times, obviously, and you led into my second question, which was going to speak about state aid. That's a good, maybe that's a good option, or the local income tax. You also mentioned the retirement reinvestment regarding the teacher's pension. I know that the larger jurisdictions have had the occasion to deal with that. If there's not going to be, was that an option that was shown, or was that something? And I'm kind of two-fisting it, so I don't have that in front of me, that particular slide.
So there are two different kind of retirement-related issues. There's one which is really just a state issue, which is that we've been putting aside an extra $75 million each year to accelerate our return to good funding. And
I was mentioning the
doesn't
teachers.
affect local governments. It's just the state trying to accelerate reducing our unfunded liability, which is what the state is on the hook for. We still pay for the unfunded liability. Now, the part that does affect locals is there's a separate, it's really just a local aid program where we give out about $28 million a year to specific counties in Baltimore City to help them offset the cost of paying the normal cost of the retirement.
Yes.
And the governor's proposal is to eliminate that $28 million program. And that does have a significant impact on Prince George's County loses about 10 million. Baltimore City loses about 10 million of that 28 million. So it doesn't directly affect anybody's retirement benefits, but it does put further stress on those local governments.
Yeah,
Okay.
and if I might interject here, that was one of the items that Treasurer Kopp and Comptroller Francho indicated they would not vote for on July 1st. So it was removed from that agenda. But as mentioned before, the governor is proposing to bring it back along with the other items August 1st.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Delegate Hayes.
Hello.
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 Can you?
Yeah.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
You can't hear me?
Yes.
You can. Okay. Thank you. Because I'm doing two things at one time.
Yeah.
my desktop, I'm at work, my desktop doesn't have a camera, so I'm using the phone for the audio. So but it's all syncing, so I'm okay. First of all, good to see everyone. And I just had a couple of quick questions, David. I don't think that it yields as that much in comparatively speaking where we probably going to need to be when I look at that close to $6 billion revenue shortfall. The bond premium, sale of bond premium, historically, I know that's to be determined, but normally, where does that number fall historically?
Well, bond premiums can vary quite a bit from year to year. We had an extraordinary bond premium at the last bond sale. I want to say it was close to $200 million. And we're expecting, because of where interest rates are, we're expecting another extraordinary premium this July, unless something changes in the next couple of weeks.
Okay.
If that happens, that will pretty much cover the fiscal 21 money that was budgeted. We already budgeted some bond premium to pay debt service and to support various capital budget priorities. So if we get good news this July, we may have largely covered the expenses we budgeted for. And that means that anything that we get in February, the next bond sale, would be money that might be able to use to help balance the budget. But who knows where the interest rates and things will be in February. But I think there is the potential for some money to be available come session to help with the budget problem.
Okay, thank you so much. And the second question I have, Madam Chair, if I can just sort of piggyback, is we have always sort of looked with an eye of the structural deficit in the out years. And so my question is, as we look at that sort of between $5.5–6 billion shortfall, we know we're gonna have to bring it in line. I mean, constitutionally, what, if any, impact does that have on the structural deficit, if any? Any at all?
Well, I mean, to be honest, right now, and certainly in our outlook that we showed you for 21 and 22, our focus has been, I mean, it's a cash problem at the moment. We're under a lot of stress.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of it's getting through the next 2 years. And then we do have a significant structural problem currently forecast. So, I mean, I think part of what you have to think about is as we get through the next 2 years, how much of the actions do you take? Do you go ahead and make them permanent so that you get structural savings and help us with that long-term problem? I think it certainly makes sense to do some of that, and you may need to do some permanent changes just to get through the problems. But I mean, a lot of our focus right now is just getting through the 2 years, because the other thing that's really hard, and I think if we showed you a structural outlook right now for the out years, it would be enormous gap. But that's because the revenue forecasts assume the economy bounces back very slowly. And I think it's really hard to know. I mean, we don't really have a firm grasp on revenue 6 months from now, right now, never mind 3 years from now. So I think it's not worth spending a lot of time focusing 3 and 4 years out, given so many uncertainties right now.
Okay, so just my last question, that sort of segues to my last question. If you look at using some of the proposed use of the rainy day fund in both 21, 22, this current budget year and next budget year, and you look at the projections for the out years in the structural deficit, is there any idea or contemplation on what that may do to our bond rating, how it may affect it?
Well, the bond rating agencies,
or if you're not in a position to answer that, that's fine. It's just a piggyback question I have. I probably can get it later.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the bond rating agencies have certainly signaled to other states who have used the rainy day fund over the years that it's very important to them to see some sort of plan to getting back to fiscal stability and to rebuilding your rainy day fund. So I think they'll understand that, you know, the sort of incredibly immediate impact of this recession may require use of the rainy day fund. And I don't think that necessarily endangers our bond rating. But if we don't have a plan and don't show that we're taking some actions that are going to help us get through the next few years, I think, and have a plan to, you know, rapidly rebuild it, then I think we have more issues with them. But I think the short-term use is less of an issue given how extraordinary the revenue decline has been.
Okay. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're welcome. Delegate Valentino.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Madam Speaker, members of the committee. Thank you, David. Just was asking if following this, you could give us some more clarification on page 5 and 4, where you talk about the BPW cuts and entitlements being at 11.2%. If you could then send us what your, under definition, what you're including as what entitlements were cut at that point for each of the different entitlements. And then
I mean, the single biggest item in entitlements is actually this 35 million cut to Medicaid, where they're assuming that the hospital deficit assessment will be raised during session. But we can send you the rest of the detail, but that's the big item.
And you said that that really can't take place until we get back to session?
Right. I mean, the general funds were cut by the board, but the governor cannot raise the deficit assessment. He needs the legislature to do that. So you would have to go along with that in the BRFA during session, or come up with an alternative way to save money somewhere in the budget. Okay,
so that is really the chunk of the entitlements. I just wanted to know if there were any others. And then is it possible for you to do a breakdown of the overall cuts that were taken and then the proposed cuts and the impact by jurisdiction?
Yeah.
So that we could then see what these impacts mean to the jurisdictions. Some of them obviously have more jurisdictional impact than others.
Yes, we actually put an analysis out, I think June 30th, and we can share it. It's on the website, on the MGI website, up near the top. That went through for the local aid programs where we know what the allocation is. We show it by county. We have a chart, and we can send that to the committee.
So yeah, if we could just kind of see the total.
Yeah, I mean, the hard part is that the governor's local aid cuts include 200 million of unspecified education cuts and 130 million of unspecified local government aid. So we've got 330 million of cuts that we don't know how to allocate because we don't know exactly what they're going to cut or how they are going to propose to allocate. So we can share for the programs where we know the allocation, like disparity grant and that supplemental retirement grant. Right. And we can send you that, but we can't give you the whole picture because there's a lot that is unallocated at the moment.
Okay, and as it happens, if you can continue to keep us posted that way in your presentations, it's helpful. Thank you, David, and thank you, Madam Chair.
Delegate Krim?
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a question, David, about on page 7, where you said that the administration identified $20 million in overtime by changing the rules. So is that a collective bargaining issue, or can you just comment on that?
It would seem like it ought to be a collective bargaining issue. As I understand it, they have not bargained at all with AFSCME. They have, or at least they've not sat down with AFSCME, who is the union who would be most impacted by that item. But I would need to defer to the Attorney General's office about whether they have to collectively bargain. But I would think that they need to. And we can follow up and confirm that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Delegate Solomon?
Thank you, Madam Chair. David, thank you for your presentation. I just had a quick question. I was going back through the document, which seems like ages ago. I guess it was back in April, that overview of federal COVID-19 assistance that DLS put together. And I was wondering, so I know the numbers that you had today were for the Coronavirus Relief Fund, but there's also this $800 million disaster relief fund that says here for the immediate needs of state and local governments, which seems, again, fairly kind of wide-ranging under various categories. And I was just wondering, does DLS have any accounting of what of that 800 million has been spent in addition to the actual relief fund that's separate?
No, we do not. We understand one of the things the federal government is allowing states to do is use the coronavirus relief fund as the match on that emergency money. So I would expect that some of that 450 million that I showed as unallocated coronavirus relief fund money will be used to then draw down even more federal funds through that emergency disaster money. But there's been no information from the administration on how they're going to use that money. Now, most of that has to be used for actual costs incurred in responding to the virus. So, I mean, it'll be more like the emergency contracts and the things the National Guard has helped with, and setting up the convention center as a hospital and those sort of costs. But I think it would be very helpful for the administration to sort of share their vision of what costs they're planning to charge to these funds that they know of at this point.
Okay. Thank you.
Delegate Beitzel?
Yeah, Madam Chair, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I tried to take my hand down, but I couldn't figure out how to do that because Geraldine asked my question, and that was the local share. But I did have one further question, if I may.
Absolutely.
Is there anything in this at all factored in if Kerwin would, the veto override would take place? Have you factored any of those numbers in anywhere?
Our assumptions are that all of the vetoes stand right now. Our forecast assumed the vetoes stand as they are. What that does beg the question, there's a lot of money in the Blueprint Fund. And, I talked about the Education Trust Fund being short. I mean, you could legislatively use the Blueprint Fund to make up for the shortfall in the casino revenues. But if the veto is going to be overridden, or there's a desire to move forward with some sort of scaled back Kerwin type plan, you probably would want to keep the Blueprint money for that. So I think there's a lot of legislative decisions to be made around how you want to approach K-12 education funding at this next session.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I actually want to follow up with that, David. If we overrode the Kerwin veto, isn't it true that the kind of fail-safe amendment they put in on the Senate side that we accepted on the House side would take effect, and Kerwin actually would not go into effect?
Right, it would just grow with inflation. So it'd be for fiscal 22. So it'd be very minimal.
Yeah.
It'd have a very minimal impact in the first year.
Thank you. All right. That's all the questions I see. Thank you, David, as always. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
And we're now going to move to the administration. And we have with us our friend, Secretary Brinkley.
Am I there? Am I popping up, Madam Chair?
Yeah, you are.
Okay. I know you can hear me. I don't know if you can see me yet because we have slides up on the screen, but
Yep. We can see you too, so be careful.
okay.
Is Mark with you?
I am.
Mark is he's
good.
online. We're not
Good.
in the same room together though. We're about
That's good.
55 miles apart now. So, Madam Chair, Madam Speaker, it's good to talk to the Appropriations Committee today, and I appreciate the opportunity. And I want to give some actually a very strong acknowledgement to David Romans and DLS and the staff for the report they put together. Madam Speaker, Madam Chair, what I'm going to go through, you're going to see is familiar to what we went through a week ago, or I guess almost 2 weeks ago, as we briefed you on some of the proposals before we went to BPW. That was on a Friday. These slides were also utilized and this is for the benefit of your membership. This is pretty much the presentation we used for the it is the presentation we use for the BPW, but the genesis of it is also DBM's contribution or participation for the bond rating agencies, which were held the day before the BPW on June 30th. The graphs and some of those charts are for the benefit of the BPW. And it would appear that, DLS utilized some of those data points, in some instances, put them out in a prettier fashion than we did. But I think you're going to see an awful lot of some of the same messaging. Why? Because the data is the data. The numbers are the numbers, and we'll go on from there. So what you have in front of you, the first slide just says, the Department of Budget Management took this to the BPW for $413.2 million in fund reductions. Of that, $394.9 million were general fund reductions to the 21. And this whole presentation just delineates the reasons for this. Let's go to slide 2. As you can tell, this challenge that we have in front of you, and when I say that the we, it's the collective we. It's you all, it's us. It certainly is the taxpayers, and it certainly are the recipients of some of these services. It's something we've never seen before, and certainly when you adjourned, we couldn't have comprehended the magnitude of what we're walking into. On May 20th, DBM presented to and the BPW adopted $121 million in reductions to the 20 budget, just so we could reach a closing status on that. The following graphs are critical to understanding the challenges we face and their cause. And again, David went through some of this. Let's go to the next slide. The first graph is very telling. Department of Labor and her sister departments in other states have been under intense scrutiny, pressure, and criticism for the handling of the unemployment claims. And while I personally am not privy to all the details of the Department of Labor's mechanics, this graphic illustrates the magnitude of the problem for applicants and those agencies as a result of the economic crisis. If you liken this to a watch or a clock, the conversations and criticism have been focused on how the instrument works. And those are very legitimate conversations. When what people really want to know is what time is it, or why am I not getting paid? For those who can't see the details, I did try to improve the graphic on it after the BPW presentation. But that line, second from the top, is 500,000 unemployment claims. It took 74 weeks for us to reach 500,000 claims in the Great Recession, the reddish line. It took 77 weeks for the early 90s recession to reach that same level. That's the yellow line. But as the blue line shows, for the coronavirus emergency, it took only 8 weeks to reach that threshold. The next slide, please. This next slide shows Maryland's payroll employment levels compared over the last decade. And the data in the table is compared to 2020's first quarter. The dashed red line shows the actual payrolls, and until this drop-off, projections for Maryland's employment according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics and Moody's Analytics. As a result of the coronavirus economic impact, Moody's prepared two scenarios, S2, the blue line, that's the optimistic line, and these are the same data points that David Romans had in his presentation and that DLS is using. We're using the same source and data points, and we acknowledge they're going to change over time. They'll constantly be modifying this, but for purposes of all these exercises, we're utilizing the same source. So the S2 blue line, which is bad, and S4, the orange line, which is undeniably worse. And for continuity, like I said, we're using the same data points. But in the optimistic scenario, employment will bottom out at the levels of the last recession. That's the blue line. But in S4, they go down even further, and we take much, much longer to recover. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is another graphic. Again, DLS had this probably cleaned up without the black and the gold and the red and the white on the top. But it indicates the temporary cash assistance caseload going back to July 2009. Since you've seen this and he did a good explanation, I don't need to read this. This is just it in a different format. Next slide, please. On this next slide, we see Moody's data points again, S4 and S2. We've illustrated across the bottom 3 fiscal years, 20, 21, and 22. Yes, we also have concerns in going beyond that, but in our immediate term, we're in 21. And it's interesting, I just had a conversation with Mako at noon. Today, DBM's capital budget team just met internally on their first meeting for the FY22 capital budget. And next week, if I'm not mistaken, on the 15th, that first agency has to come in and make its presentation. So what you don't know, what I didn't know when I was a legislator, was by the time when you get ready to see the budget, when the governor submits it, DBM has already gone through the summer and even the fall putting the next budget together. We're starting that process now for the 22 budget, and it begins in 51 or 50 weeks. So we have to have some type of firm grasp for the numbers on the 21 budget, just so that we can get that in front of the governor and then get it on to you. So what you have here, again, I referenced the bottom lines, which is the 3 fiscal years, the more favorable line, which has the data points. And as David Romans had mentioned, we are moving more toward the favorable side just because that is our more recent experience. For FY20, a reduction in revenues of $925 million. And for 21, it shows $2.1 billion basically. And for 22, $2.6 billion in reduction of revenue from our most recent forecast just 3 months ago. And the orange line obviously is much more sobering, $2.63 billion in the current fiscal year. And for the year, which begins, like I say, in 50 weeks, nearly $4 billion. This next slide is very, very telling too. Let's go to this. This is a graph that DBM created, and hence the title. Mark created it. Mark is very creative with his titles there. So go on in a flash. The gray line that you see starting to the left is the actual revenues attained back to FY 2015. And the green line shows the revenue projections as recently as the last BRE estimates. Yellow line is S2. That's the one that we're working toward. But you cannot forget that red line is there, S4, the very challenging and problematic scenario, which again, Moody's has compiled. The dashed line connects the S4 back to the beginning, where revenues actually were for 2016, which began in 2015, which were passed by the General Assembly in the spring of 2015 and created based on agency feedback and requests in the fall of 2014. That is staggering. That is absolutely staggering. And yet this is what we're trying to be defensive against. The next slide, please. So again, Madam Treasurer or not Madam Treasurer, Madam Chair and Speaker, you've seen these slides before because they were presented to you as we were preparing for the three bond rating agencies. But on behalf of for the benefit of your committee members, we highlight the spending and hiring freeze immediately implemented, the earlier actions of the BPW in May, and acknowledgement that while we have had increases in Medicaid, a change to the federal match actually helped our bottom line in our budget. That was a positive interpretation from Treasury. And changing some of the interpretation from the Treasury Department has allowed us to use Federal CARES Act funding to offset police and related budgets. When we did the BPW action on May 20th, that number was $50 million. We anticipate that by the time we close out 20, that number will be $90 million that we can help bolster up the bottom line for 20 and the closeout. We're anticipating that by the time the current calendar year ends, which is the deadline for the CARES funding, at least under the current guidelines, is December 30th. Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's $175 million that we think will be able to offset our general funds through some of the federal CARES monies.
That's correct.
We are utilizing, there's been some criticism, at least from some of the counties, or one county in particular I can think of, that they were highlighting that they were protecting their bottom line, their cash reserves, so they could move forward with the next budget, but criticizing us for not utilizing ours. Well, let's keep in mind, and I want to, I guess, touch a little bit on David's comments on this. I'm going off script a little bit, that we see the rainy day fund as a shock absorber, and there should be no surprise in that. It's exactly for that if we hit some tough times so that we can maintain a continuity of service and try to weather the storm. We have to identify what the storm is and how long it's going to go. We certainly know what the storm is now. We just don't know how long that's going to be, and we don't know if there's going to be any backfill. The rating agencies, as Delegate Haynes had mentioned on it, but they don't care that we use it. And again, this is what David had mentioned. They don't really care that we use it. They do want to see, and their primary concern is that we reinstate it or get it back up to the threshold where it actually is meaningful. Our statute says that we have to have a 5% minimum of our general fund revenues. Some of the rating agencies are criticizing that as being a little too low. The criticisms are not directed to Maryland per se, because other states have that same threshold. They're just saying states in general should have a little bit more in the bank than that. But for now, as David had said, they're kind of putting some of that on the shelf because they recognize we have to go in and utilize some of this. So we do plan to dip into it a little bit for 20 to close the books out and maintain a decent fund balance moving forward. We know we're going to have to use it more so for the current year, but we also have to have it bolstered because no one's really talking about it. You're starting to hear conversations about it for 22. If we're to maintain, put together something that's workable for 22, we have to make sure that we have some access to that. And I don't know that it's in any of these slides, but our general thought had been to use a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 approach just to get us through 21. 1/3 of budget reductions to the BPW. Identify things that we can take to BPW. And again, we can be criticized for this all anybody wants to, but the idea was to identify items to take to BPW, have those actions done sooner rather than later. I've likened it to a racing dive as opposed to a deep dive. That if we do a racing dive, we don't have to go as deep. We can make it last a longer period of time, the reductions, but we don't have to cut as deep. Whereas if, and I do know that David did reference this, if a lot of actions are pushed to you to take action on, and then they are adopted, that becomes more of a steep dive where the reductions have to be taken more immediate And there's not as much time for the agency or the beneficiaries or recipients to accommodate that. So any criticism notwithstanding, that's been the thinking behind getting things out and getting them out there quickly. And Madam Chair, Madam Speaker, the other thought, and this is just David Brinkley in my role as Budget Secretary, is to lay everything on the table so anybody who is standing expecting to receive some monies recognizes that some of these items could be jeopardized in the next legislative session. Keep in mind, you would have to weigh in, you collectively as the legislature, you and the House and the Senate. But if any actions are taken at that point in time, they could be very steep and very severe. But at the same time, that allows you to weigh in on it. And the third part to that pie would be the utilization of the rainy day fund, number one. Number two, backfill of federal monies. If that should happen, that's great. But that's been another one of our thoughts there that would preserve, again, the RDF and maybe lessen some of the impacts elsewhere. And also, if the economy turns around, if we do end up with some numbers coming in for whatever reason, but we can't think that that's going to happen and we can't safely accommodate that. That would be a dividend. That would be great if that were to happen, but we can't count on that. And therefore you have what we have going forward. This next slide that we have is just a summary of what we did in FY20 to get to the bottom line. Originally, and I don't know, Madam Speaker and Madam Chair, if we had the two columns on this, we did away with the S4 column just so that people could see with what we're actually dealing with. That we anticipated the shortfall of 925. We had when the budget was passed, you anticipated a surplus of 346. We took BPW reductions. Normally, we budget for $35 million of agency reversions. And that number had been smaller before, but we've bolstered it in the past. We're targeting here that we're going to get $350 million. Why? Because there was that hiring freeze, because we did have, we put a stop to out-of-state travel. A lot of things when they just shut down, also the agencies didn't spend some of those monies. This is where we anticipate that the federal fund swaps would account for about $90 million. And if all those scenarios hold up and we project, again, the goal here was to close out at 125, which is normally what you close your budgets with. We had already tapped into the rainy day fund to the tune of $144 million, but we would have the rainy day fund balance, that pre-transfer of 1.18, and this would leave us with just over $1 billion. Mark, I started messing something up there. The rainy day fund, is that what we're actually tapping? Is that what we tap or what we plan to do under this scenario? And therefore, that leaves us with the $1.03 billion going forward into 21. I think that's how it would be more accurately portrayed.
Correct. Under this scenario, we would leave a surplus of $125 million, but to get that surplus, we would need to transfer $144 million out of the rainy day fund, bringing the balance down to $1.036 billion.
Okay. Yeah, I'd messed it up in my conversation there, but we've got it back on track there. So again, that seems to be tracking along S2 and seems to be where we are. If we can get away with taking less out, we will, because again, you do see the shock of what's coming with the current year, much less 22. The next slide. Given the severity and the suddenness of the declines in revenues, this is why we're taking things to the BPW. This was the idea that we had. We're trying to incorporate what we had before going forward with the spending freeze on July 1st. The BPW, we took the reductions of 395. They were adopted. And again, we will continue to take the interpretations that come out of the Department of Treasury. And I can indicate to you, they change pretty much weekly, more so in our favor. We're not finding them granting some interpretation and then pulling it back. But we just don't know if the money is going to be forthcoming from Washington. It might be, but we can't count on it now as we go forward. And therefore, we will be monitoring things continuously to see as they're interpreted. I'll just point out, I like touting my team's horn, and Mark Nicole, who's on the call here, the Deputy Secretary, is also president of the National Association of State Budget Officers. So he is on those calls all the time with the Treasury and the White House. And he's been participating in a lot of panels as we're trying to help other states also figure out what a lot of this means. What my point in touting that is that when we see some new interpretation coming by, sometimes I get a text or an email at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock at night saying, we just got this detail and this is where we're going. Let's go to the next slide, the budget reductions. We were looking to level fund local aid where possible. Right now, that area is focused just on the community colleges. Yes, we took away the programmed increases for the community colleges. They're still receiving $249 million in the budget. One philosophy we had is, it wasn't necessarily uniform, but it was for some aid purposes, was to at least use FY20 as the baseline. If we could get people back to 20, just not adopt some of the increases, we can still see where this is going and what has to happen. We can always release money. We can't always get it back after it's been spent. And again, until we can wrap our arms around what this is going to do. Eliminate or reduce mandated funding. In some instances, in some areas where there were outright grants, we'd propose just like a 5 or a 10% reduction in what some of those grants were. Reduce the general fund PAYGO funding in 21. Again, what I'm advised from Terry, particularly with the capital budget side, is that all the projects are important as long as they got their phase 1, phase 2 in and things like that. Frequently, we're able to cash flow some of the projects. That's why you have a 5-year capital budget as opposed to just going 12 or 24 months. For instance, the Eastern Shore, Mark, what is it? The Eastern Shore, UMES with the pharmacy school over there. The money's in the budget, the money's prepared to move forward. They can't get a contractor on board to move forward. So that's just a cash flow challenge. We're still committed to it. And that was the part of the reasoning why we could take some of the money out of the FY20 PAYGO account on that aspect. But we are committed to making sure it moves forward. And we're also trying to identify those areas that you have made as a mandate that shall come out as basically a capital project through PAYGO, but that still qualifies for capital budget funding. And then, our goal was to try to move some of that over there. David referenced that. He indicated that there wasn't a firm commitment to do that, but we have, depending on the project, each one has to be looked at individually to move some of those forward. Right now, the crisis is to get operating cash flow and make sure that we can do that. And we can always backfill those items as long as our corridors and as long as our affordability indices are not violated. That's something that the Capital Debt Affordability Committee will have to take up in September as we see where assessments on property and things like that are going forward. We don't anticipate layoffs at this time, but we are continuing to really press on agencies. And I get, literally while I've been making this presentation, I got it. Whoops, sorry about that. My phone fell over. Can you still hear me okay? I didn't know if I hit a button.
You're good.
Okay, thanks. It fell over and I didn't know if I had silenced it or turned it off. Literally while doing these presentations, I received a request from an agency for out-of-state travel. And I'll have to evaluate that. So for instance, we have granted certain waivers in some areas. We had bomb detection dogs that had to go for certification early on in the COVID crisis. We went ahead and let people go out of state. If there were some items that had to deal with the COVID emergency itself per se, we allowed DNR to go into Delaware for some fisheries things. They were time sensitive, and as long as people weren't staying overnight. And then the other thing with DNR, we're in an agreement that some of our firefighters with the Forestry Service are on a mutual aid agreement that if they end up with a bad fire out west, we don't know where it would be, we don't know when it would be, but on a case-by-case basis, we're releasing some of those individuals. There were some requests that have come in that I denied. Having some law enforcement go down to Georgia for some activities that they had there, I just deemed that it wasn't a priority at that point in time. So those are the kind of administrative things that we're looking at and trying to deal with. What that last bullet point says here is the detail on the reduction items in plain language was literally the BPW document, which you all have access to if you want to go to the BPW site. We shared that with the bond rating agencies too. The next slide. So the largest BPW reductions were in higher education, as David referenced, to the tune of $131 million. Again, there are lots of other challenges that they have there that they're trying to deal with timing of getting people back in. They have sufficient cash reserves, and they also have been the recipients of some of the federal monies. And I have to point out that we had been in extensive conversations with those agencies. And I think, we're continuing to communicate back and forth with what some of the needs are, what they're experiencing. For example, we were able to identify that they are providing security services in some of their own communities, and that would qualify for some of the federal money, so we can backfill it with some of that. Some of the health challenges that they have as they're trying to deal with some of the housing situations, where I think instead of having 2 students to a dorm, theoretically just 1 per dorm for health purposes, there might be able to be a backfilling on that. Mark, you want to touch base on that while I take a swig of water here and save my throat? Okay.
Sorry, I was muted because the dog was barking a little bit ago.
Oh, okay. My dog wants out, but
yeah, so we did, as part of the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, did provide $10 million to community colleges to help address Marylanders in need of additional job retraining to help get them back into the workforce.
Okay. But the higher educations, we had those conversations. This is where what Mark just touched on is, while we made a reduction of 36 million to the anticipated increase, there was a backfilling there. Health, the deficit assessment, you guys can weigh in on this. We are planning on banking $35 million from that. If you don't do it, that's fine, but then you'll just have to find $35 million somewhere else. But the BPW did acknowledge it and is able to put that in the books for now. The WMATA, $28 million is the 25% there. There's a very lengthy ongoing conversation along all of this. And you guys, again, will have the opportunity to weigh in on anything else that could come up on this. On the juvenile services aspect, Secretary Abbott had been very aggressive in the sense that their populations had been rapidly decreasing, particularly with this, with the virus and the health situation, to the point that he closed down 2 facilities, and we're able to reflect some of those going forward. So those are some of the items that we had on that. Some other, you can go to the next slide, COVID-19 related expenditures. David went into much more detail on this, but there was $2.34 billion that came in. It goes into how we're allocating some of that. We distributed $364 million to the other 19 jurisdictions. Just in case there's one person not knowing that's on the call, the 5 jurisdictions which have more than 500,000 residents had a direct pipeline to Treasury. Therefore, they were given their monies on a per capita basis directly. But the other 19 jurisdictions, there was discretion as to whether the governor would share this with them or not. We ended up doing that. Not all states did. New York State did not. North Carolina, I think, only passed along 25% of this and kept it in their pocket, but we went ahead and distributed some of that. The guidance that we could use some of this money to match the FEMA reimbursement requirement was very, very helpful. And again, the governor continues to roll out new ideas and some programs on how we can do that. The next slide goes into some of the announcements. David had it very concise, where he took all these different slides and had them all into one page, which is a good summary. The only thing I'll point out that's a little different, it's not really on this one though, is we did, oh yes, there's one part here that is. We did $10 million in rural broadband through what was marked, that was the GEER, the Governor's Emergency, I can't remember what the acronym for.
Right, relief fund, that's the next slide.
Yeah, okay. And then we did $10 million here. We did an additional $10 million for rural broadband on that. So let's go to the next slide if that's where that is.
Yeah, it is.
Okay. And then we also, and Madam Chair, because we recognize that even in the urban areas, there were access issues and challenges, $5 million was dedicated to urban broadband. The School for the Deaf, School for the Blind, there was a little opportunity to send some their way. The Innovative Education Solutions, again, we're trying to direct some resources because honestly, they really don't know how they're going to deal with some of this, and that's why it's innovative, is to try to give some creativity and flexibility in some of the new mechanisms that they're going to have for education. So let's go to the next slide. Again, immediate budget actions are needed. David's 14th slide was, and I even sent him an email after I saw it to give him credit. It was just very succinct in a very dispassionate way. It does roll out the magnitude of it. And Madam Chair and Madam Speaker, our goal has been that the sooner we take some actions, however controversial, and again, this is where I've tried to communicate to some people and some agencies that level funding to 2020's level is a victory. It enables things to keep going, keep chugging forward while we discover what's going to happen with this and determine the magnitude of it, and then identify some of those challenges that we have to go forward with. So we're going to get across the finish line. And right now, our attempt is to mitigate the pain and challenges in addressing all this sooner. The bond rating agencies expect states to respond quickly, especially those of us that are AAA rated. And, again, our challenge is this is, and I was glad to hear DLS's commentaries on some of that, because what I'm trying to educate people on is just the magnitude for 22 as we're just putting this together. If people were upset with what's going on with this, it's going to be absolutely shocking. Yes, we have our fingers crossed. We'll get some additional federal aid. We don't know what that's going to be. We don't know when that's going to come. And we don't know what strings are going to be attached as to how we can utilize that. The last slide is just simply reiterating again, this was for the bond rating agencies that we had, that we are committed to acting in a fiscally prudent manner throughout all this and taking some actions and starting the conversations to make some mid-year reductions. We don't want to do that. We did some in 20. We did some already in 21, but we're going to have to make more as time goes on. And again, we're just going to be monitoring the federal and federal actions and any revenues that come in. The next Board of Revenue estimates will not meet until mid-September. I think I know I've shared this with you before, but just to remind your members, Madam Chair, that the teams that through the Comptroller's Office, DLS, and DBM meet pretty much weekly. Maybe that's a little too aggressive, but at least every other week to review what has come in from a revenue perspective, what was anticipated, how does it stack up to last month, how does it stack up to this time last year. They've identified some anomalies, things that we wouldn't expect, but then some other things that we had expected to hold true and remain steady didn't. And yet we revisit that all the time, which is why we feel right now we can settle on the S2 line. And it's not because there's been any formal meetings, but some of the data that they've been getting in here. So we do plan to use the rainy day fund. We don't plan to exhaust it, but that is one scenario that we can do. This is not in the slides, but I did use it at noon. If we utilize a significant portion of the $1 billion in the rainy day fund, that's fine. But when we put together the 22 budget, the first dollars we spend out are constitutionally required to satisfy the bondholders. The second dollars go to reinforcing the rainy day fund. And, they might be offset by some sweepers and things like that. But the fact of the matter is we have to maintain that. And for our purposes here, I think the 5% threshold would be in the $850 million range. So that's all that I have. And I know that some of you have heard some of this before, seen it before. I think this is about my 14th time of going through some of these slides. We keep trying to change up the order every now and then to change the message a little bit to make it reflective of some new data we have, or particularly the graphics up front. We found that once we could put some of the graphics up front to show the picture of what's going on, particularly with unemployment and our projections going forward, it really becomes sobering. It's not just about numbers going out the door. It's about how we got to where we are and the importance of trying to maintain some continuity going forward. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, again, if you want to ask a question, scroll down to participants and indicate you want to ask a question, and I will call on you. And the first question goes to Delegate Valentino.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Secretary Brinkley, for your presentation and your level of sincerity with commitment to working with the General Assembly. My question is, the state of emergency order that's in effect has certainly had, a significant economic impact for the state in a lot of ways. And most importantly, while it's in effect, it also continues to prevent a certain level of evictions and allows some rent and mortgage things, also unemployment. So I am thinking that a lot of this budget prediction is based on the assumption that an emergency order will remain in effect through an extended amount of time, or are there budget predictions here that assume a lifting and an economic change in things based on a lifting of the emergency order?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to it. I don't know that the length of the emergency order it factors into anything that we've utilized. Mark, are you aware of anything that comes into play on that? It certainly has an impact, but I don't know that we have an economic or a cost per se, that if it were to be lifted the end of August or the end of September, or exactly what would happen on that. I just don't know that it's been taken into account.
No, I would say at the state level, we have not factored in the emergency at all. I would say, though, that the federal health emergency is something that we need to closely monitor because that is what allows the state to claim enhanced FMAP. And right now we will be able to get that enhanced FMAP through the end of the third quarter of the calendar year. And if the federal government extends it into September, then we will be able to qualify for an additional quarter. And we get somewhere in the magnitude of $140 million a quarter. So that could help us with the increased Medicaid caseload that we're seeing now.
So is it fair to say that there's no sense that the emergency order would be lifted before we got back into session?
I think it's entirely, I have no way to gauge that. I just don't know. We'd love to see it lifted, but I think the governor has other policy drivers and other advisors, and that's all just simply a function of public safety and how we respond to it. You do see that, unlike other parts of the country, we're right now, fingers crossed, I think it's just a question of time when we start to see spikes and cases going back up.
Right now, because we have concerns or at least I know if it were lifted, it would have a significant impact on housing rental, 30 million that was released may or may not be enough, but the impact of what would happen to the budget and to the economy with just the severe housing insecurity that we would see, I think would be significant if the emergency order were lifted without plans to address that.
No doubt. No doubt.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Delegate Krim.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good to see you, Secretary. I want to follow up on Delegate Valentino Smith's point about evictions. For the longest time, our office was really focused on constituent services for unemployment, and we're still working with that. But I think, I'm going to say optimistically, I think the crisis has passed. I think we're getting to everybody. But I think the next big constituent issue out there is evictions. And I think we're going to get hit hard with this. We set up a local fund here in Frederick County, but I think that's going to be depleted quickly. So I know that the governor has 30 million. Mr. Romans identified 450 million of unallocated coronavirus relief funds. I'm wondering if we could set aside some of that for this eviction relief, because I think we're going to get hit hard on that very, very soon. Thank you.
Yeah, Mark has been in extensive conversations with also what some other states are into. So Mark, why don't you go ahead and take this? Because there's no doubt that is an issue that we're looking at. The other thing that we're hearing is, what about some of the property owners who aren't getting rent payments and yet they still have obligations to perhaps a lending institution or whatever they've got? There is certainly a domino effect there, but you're absolutely right. That's a challenge we have. Mark, you want to step in on it?
Sure. So, Delegate Krim, I wanted to let you know that we are following up with MEMA at the state level and then with FEMA at the federal level to see if eviction assistance qualifies as an eligible expense under disaster relief. And if it does, we could get funded. We could spend $3 federal and match it with $1. So that $30 million all of a sudden could become 120. So we are pursuing that avenue.
Good.
Great. Good to hear.
That is great.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're welcome.
See, that's the advantage to having him also at the top of that national organization, to be right at the table as they're having those conversations and to communicate back the necessity for it.
Right. That's good. Delegate Henson.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you, Madam Speaker, for joining us. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I think that the point has been made by my colleagues, the urgency of the housing crisis that we're facing. If I may, the courts are going to start processing warrants of restitution again on July 25th. Sheriffs will be able to evict people. So the crisis is imminent and we have a date certain on when that is going to correct. We also know that the courts are also going to start hearing on July 20th cases for breaches of lease and then also tenant holdovers. So as the court ramps up its efforts again to allow property owners to be able to get people out of properties, we know that it's a race against the clock for our tenants. I'm hearing from DHCD that the $30 million that the governor has is probably not going to be able to be operational until sometime at the end of August. So the two timelines are not necessarily intersecting in a way that's going to be able to be effective for all of Maryland's renters. So I would like just more specifics on what the timeline is with the $30 million.
Mark, that can be yours too.
Sure. So I'm going to have to follow up with DHCD and get you some additional information, Delegate.
Thank you. All right, you'll get that information. Actually, why don't you get it to the entire committee?
I will do that.
This is I just did today an email blast to my entire email list about rental assistance. This is on our minds right now. And you're absolutely right. The timelines don't match, so we need to just stay on this. All right, Delegate Solomon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Brinkley, it's good to see you. Deputy Secretary Nickel, thanks for being here as well. I wanted to just echo the statements of my colleagues, particularly around childcare. Many of us have been working really closely with Superintendent Salmon, and we know, from the reports that there's going to be a crisis. There's already a financial crisis in our childcare system. So I would also urge, as you're figuring out, what to do with the remaining Relief Act money that we've got to, really emphasize potentially, financial support to our childcare system as well. But the set of questions that I wanted to ask you, it's a few of them with what I hope will be short answers. I wanted to raise an issue that I was really concerned about last week, and it's not, a tremendous amount of money, but I think it just sent such a terrible signal to our state employees, to to the folks that we're asking to really tighten their belts, was the hiring of Steve Krim to work in the Department of Budget and Management. At a time where we're potentially asking our state employees who are literally risking their lives on a regular basis, to take furloughs, to take pay cuts. We still have thousands of people in our state who are unemployed. I just not really sure how we can justify the hiring of somebody at that cost. And so I guess I was wondering, first off, if you could tell me who authorized the hiring of Mr. Krim, even though we have a hiring freeze, which you highlighted your, I think, really judicious nature in denying out-of-state requests. So can you tell me who authorized the hiring of Mr. Krim?
I did, because I'm the one who signs off on any type of variances, just as I also signed off on the new executive director of the MIA. She came on board and is looking for an executive assistant. Why? Because not the executive assistant, the chief of staff there. Why? Because the other one has gone on also with the previous MIA. So at certain levels, we have to have some continuity and some movement. We're still hiring correctional officers. We have critical shortages there. So as we go through any type of request, they have to come through DBM, and depending on where that is, then we'll move forward on it. But I hear your concern. I understand it, and I'll acknowledge that. But I'm the one who made that decision.
Well, so I appreciate the honesty on that. I guess, sort of following up on that question, what is his role? What is his title? Who was he replacing? I mean, to me, there is clearly a need. We've had hearing after hearing after hearing about the crisis in our criminal justice system. There's clearly a need for, for more folks in our prison. But what was the role? What was the gap that Mr. Krim was filling?
We have a serious challenge ahead of us with communication on what we're doing, by virtue of the fact you can even see some of the pushback we got early on. And so that's what I see as the prime role, is ensuring that we have some communication that's moving forward and able to move forward in dealing with this budget crisis. He's going to be a very valuable asset. He's done, I think, a great job before in his connections with the governor, and able to put forward some strategies and moving forward. We have some serious challenges to go forward with, and I'm pleased to have him on board with us.
I guess I appreciate your candor. We've seen reports that unions were not, I guess, can you elaborate a little bit more on what that communication plan will look like, the outreach? I mean, what is, it doesn't seem like he has a tremendous amount of budget expertise either. I mean, based on, I spent a good bit of time looking at his LinkedIn profile. So, I mean, is he purely on board for communications, or what do you expect? What role do you expect him to fill?
No, I'm not going to go any further into it. We were here to discuss what was going on at the Board of Public Works action and some other things going on. And I'm not going to go into personnel actions in here.
All right. Thank you.
Delegate Corman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I look forward to the personnel subcommittee briefing where we do go into personnel issues. That'll be a very fascinating meeting. Obviously, there's a lot of really critical issues that people have raised. And the one I'm going to raise is not quite as critical, but it's still important. And I feel some stewardship over it, which is the WMATA budget cuts. Mr. Secretary, your words in describing those cuts were, there was a lengthy and ongoing conversation, or there is a lengthy and ongoing conversation. I guess I'm curious who that conversation was with and what it was about. I tried to reach out to you about these cuts actually when they were proposed, didn't hear back. I appreciate you're a busy person. My understanding is WMATA was not consulted. Our regional partners were not consulted. It's not even clear to me that MDOT was consulted before the budget cuts were proposed. Our chair has often talked about the problems with the general fund subsidizing the transportation trust fund. This could be a great example of the problem because it puts into the hand of DBM transportation trust fund decisions. So I'm curious, what you think this cut is, and do you expect MDOT to backfill it, and what the communication was with MDOT and WMATA and our regional partners about that cut? Because obviously, if we make cuts like this and the proposed cuts you have as potential future items, the other jurisdictions as part of WMATA will as well. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, we also know that in the short term, WMATA received $800 million from the federal government. If I'm not mistaken, that goes toward all three different jurisdictions too. So there was a significant cash infusion brought about there. I also pointed out that we recognize they had a significant cut in some of their revenues they received, yet they still have some of the maintenance concerns and some of those challenges going forward. We have had conversations with the Secretary, Jacqueline, Mark, I can't remember Jacqueline's last name, but she did a phenomenal job in going into some of the detail because some of the bond rating agencies had asked some of the questions. So she was there specifically to address some of those concerns and conversations. Again, this is an item that's in the general fund. Right now, we're trying to pull back everywhere that we can, but you'll also get the opportunity to weigh in on the balance of it when things come around. And by that point in time, people may or may not know where some of the straws are resting on some of this. Mark, anything you want to chime in?
No, nothing additional.
All right.
Yeah, just to follow, Mr. Secretary, so did you consult with WMATA before proposing this cut?
I don't know. I personally did not.
Okay.
I think transportation had been in extensive conversations with them, but I personally did not.
Right. So I reached out to you when this cut was proposed. I reached out to others as well. And my understanding is that actually there was no communication about this cut. Obviously, there's been an ongoing conversation about the need for all the funding jurisdictions of WMATA to pull back a little bit. The challenge is the general fund contribution to WMATA is for their quote unquote dedicated funding. If you look at the administration's transportation funding plan, it's called the governor's dedicated funding for capital. Well named because he signed a great dedicated funding bill. Dedicated funding is to get a good bond rating on WMATA bonds. Well, if we're cutting it 125 million out of 167 million, as has been proposed, that's not very dedicated. So I guess I'd like to hear more about, in follow-up, I respect that you don't have the information off the top of your head, the actual communication that occurred with our compact partners in WMATA and the agency itself before proposing pretty significant cuts to our contribution.
Okay.
Would you commit to providing that follow-up to me within the next 10 or 14
I'll see if I can find out for you. I personally have not been in those conversations. That's what I just shared with you.
No, so I understand that, Mr. Secretary, but you are the Secretary.
But I can certainly reach out and find out where, if at all, those have taken place, and then see that can be shared.
I appreciate it. Thank you for being here, and good luck. I know you have a difficult task, both immediately in front of you and in the medium and long term. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you. I see no other questions, but I do want to thank you, Mr. Secretary, and Mark also for a very thorough walkthrough of the tasks and challenges ahead of us. And I'm sure we'll be in very close contact, as you can see, through this process. So thank you very much. And to the committee, thank you for your attendance. We have been through a very unusual past 3 months. So we will be continuing to do oversight on the budget and the cuts that are proposed at the Board of Public Works, plus work with the administration in the budget decisions ahead. So thank you, and everybody stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.